Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to GeoChemISTea, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. Our mission is to inspire future geochemists and to introduce our listeners to niche geochemistry topics. I'm your host, Sam Schur, and this month we're talking with Mike Stock about magma systems, from the ones that erupt at the surface to the ones that freeze deep below it. Mike Stock is a professor at Trinity College Dublin. Mike, welcome to GeoChemISTea.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for having me on the show.
You are welcome, but I'm more excited. So, Mike, can you tell us a bit about your journey in the geosciences and in geochemistry?
Yeah, so I guess like many people, I did science subjects at school. I was really interested in physics and chemistry and things like that. And I liked geography. But in England, where I'm from, most schools don't really teach so much geology. And when I was young, when I was a teenager, we just happened to have a geologist move into the house next door to us. And he gave me some really cool internship experience working with Petro-Canada in London in the kind of petroleum industry. And as I was approaching kind of college age, I was thinking about what to do. And I was really swaying towards chemistry, just doing pure chemistry as a subject. And this guy said, sure, look, that's an Irish expression. Sure, look, you could do chemistry and stay in a lab all day, or you could do geology and get into geochemistry, and then you can do the stuff you're interested in and also get out into the field and go hiking and all the other stuff that I love doing in my free time. So I ended up doing that at college. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Southampton in the UK at the UK National Oceanography Institute, which I guess is like Scripps or Woodhull or whatever the US equivalent is of that.
I think you're right.
Yeah, and then I started a PhD doing kind of uranium ore stuff, which I didn't really like. So I had a bit of an odd journey in that sense. I started a PhD, which I stopped because I realized that I really love volcanoes. Went to the University of Oxford, did a PhD on Italian volcanoes and what causes Italian volcanoes to erupt. Then did a postdoc in Cambridge on Galápagos, and then came to Trinity College Dublin, where I became much more interested in orthomagmatic mineralization and the sort of link, I guess, between mineralizing processes and volcanic processes in magmatic systems.
I'm dead. I have so many questions. I love everything. I guess I have personal questions about this.
That's all right.
That's all right. So, something that I think is really neat is that you have this jump, say, between the more pure volcanic processes to this kind of orthomagmatic mineralization style things. I did a master's on a volcano in Indonesia where we just were looking at it from the context of this is an actively forming epithermal system, which was wild. So my jump in that sense was taken for me by my professor, who is an economic geology professor for many years. He's going to be like Professor Binns and Harry Potter and die while teaching in the classroom kind of thing. But that's neither here nor there. That said, how did you make that jump?
I guess fundamentally, I'm just interested in the chemical processes that happen in magmas in the Earth's crust. And I don't, on the most basic level, I guess I don't really care whether that causes a volcano to erupt or whether it causes a mineral deposit to form. When I was in Cambridge, I was pretty fortunate. There was a nice group there working on Skaregard and Bushveld and these types of layered intrusion systems. And I became friends with the postdocs there, started attending their research group meetings. And I was still working on very volcanic stuff, active volcanoes and eruption triggers and things. But I started to learn more about layered intrusion systems. And then when I moved over to Ireland, the system here is quite different to the UK and the US. There's not so much funding for kind of, I suppose, like blue skies theoretical research. Everything is much more applied. And so when I moved over to Trinity College, I was fishing around for what I could work on, what sorts of grants I could look at. And I realized that there are a whole load of layered intrusions, Paleogene age 60 million year old or so layered intrusions in the north of Ireland, associated with the Giant's Causeway and that kind of famous geology up there, which nobody had really worked on since the 1960s, 1970s. Obviously, there was the Troubles in the North, and between the 1960s and like now, it was not an easy place to work. And so there was this big gap. But what had been happening there was some mining companies that had licenses and been exploring for orthomagmatic sulfide type mineralization. And so it just seemed like a great way to use the skills that I developed and shift into another research area where it was possible to get some funding, but I could also explore those first order process-based problems, but from a different angle.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love that. I think that I have many questions that I would like to ask personally, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, talk about it
But
offline.
that's, yeah, exactly. But I think that's a really interesting journey of just how you went from high school through to a pure volcano journey, which I love, something that I was interested in as well until I sat in an economic geology course and I was like, wow, these are really related and these are cooler. A little bit maybe to what you're doing now, and just like the way that you always have to pivot to where the funding is in the US now. I mean, for sure we don't have that much longer, if at all, in the geosciences of doing pure blue sky things too. So it's something that researchers are now looking to the mining industry for, and it's just, yeah, we've been here the whole time and maybe we weren't good enough for you before. Here we are. Very cool though. Look, I want to thank you for sharing this with us, but now it's time for tea time. We've talked a little bit it offline. So the kettle is hot and it's time to spill.
All right, so this is Sam had to introduce me beforehand to the fact that tea time is not tea and biscuits in the English sense. But I
If
guess,
you, just to quickly interrupt, if you listen to an episode that's going to be two before this with Echoes, you're going to see that we actually talk about just tea and everything. I think the concept of it was just too much. It was amazing.
no, yeah, tea time in England has quite a specific meaning, and it's different.
And it's very specific over here too.
Okay. So I guess like the thing that I think your listeners would be pretty interested in is just doing field work in the Galapagos. That was one of the biggest privileges of my career. I've been to Galapagos only twice, but both for quite long trips. And it was a crazy experience. It takes a long time to get there. As you can imagine, like the Galapagos Islands are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they're heavily protected, mostly obviously because of the endemic species and the kind of crazy biodiversity. But they're also active volcanoes, and there's an eruption in Galapagos every like three or 4 years. So they're really
Wow.
volcanically active. The first time that I went there, we more or less did a tour around the archipelago. So we chartered a boat and we lived aboard a boat for about 3 weeks, going between the different islands, taking samples of the rocks because it's so hard to get to. There are really not very many papers written. There's a handful of people who have worked on the geochemistry over the years, but not very much at all. So we took this boat around. I was horribly seasick. One of the
I
reasons
can't imagine. Oh,
Oh, geez. One of the reasons Galapagos has this crazy biodiversity is because there's a convergence of ocean currents from
I
all
didn't
different
know
places.
that.
Yeah, so there's like cold water coming up from the south and water
Yeah.
coming from the west and the north. And that means the waveforms are just unpredictable and crazy. And we were in this flat-bottomed boat with sails, like it was a converted smuggling ship that was taking us around the place. And they do a lot of scientific stuff, but it was slow going over these waves, and we were going between these different islands trying to collect samples of recent eruptions and that sort of thing. And yeah, the first one we went over to Floriana Island, which is right in the south of Galapagos. I saw dolphins and like albatross and things like that, but was way too sick to appreciate them. And
Yeah.
the crew of the boat just took like pity on me and found these sheltered bays. And so for the first few nights, we were like going to these sheltered spots. And then later on in the trip, we went right to the north of the Galapagos archipelago, which was super cool. It was these crazy lava fields. There was basically no vegetation at all. Mad animals up there, flightless cormorants, penguins, Galapagos penguins, and the iguanas and everything. And we were going around the coast of the island, just hopping off the boat onto a rib. The rib was taking us up to the cliffs, and you jump off the rib, try and hold on to the lava when the boat got swept out behind you, climb up and take samples, and then get back. And it was a cool experience. And I never forget we were coming back from the north of the archipelago back to the main island in kind of a storm. The waves were really big, boat full of rocks, basalt rocks at that time. And I just remember by that time I'd got over my sickness and we were on the just on the top of the boat in these big waves, and all of a sudden, everywhere around us, there were these rays, these ray fish jumping out. We see thousands of them everywhere you could look, and it turns out that's a behavior of the animals that they just play in the bad weather and just jump as high as they can out of the sea and splash around. So that was a mad experience. And then on that trip back, I was looking at the rocks and saw black basalt, and then there's one volcano in the middle of Galapagos where it's like white pumice, like I don't know, like 10 feet thick pumice airfall deposits and pumice rafts out in the sea. And then I was like, I need to come back here and look at this volcano. There's only 2 papers ever written about that volcano. And so that was the second trip. We went out 2 years ago, took a boat out to the bottom of this volcano, which is called Alcedo. And in that case, we hiked up the volcano from the bottom, took about 10 hours to hike up, and camped at the summit for about 2 weeks before hiking back down. And that was cool. It's the biggest breeding ground of giant tortoise on Earth. So we were up there, pitched our tents, and you couldn't leave your tent without seeing giant tortoise all around you as we were going about sampling these pumice deposits.
They were at the top of the volcano?
Yeah, they live at the top. There are thousands of them. It's genuinely the biggest breeding ground of these enormous giant tortoise. And they live at the top, kind of do their thing, and then they go down to where the kind of clouds are sitting and there's more water and they breed around there. The crazy thing is these giant tortoise, they take the same path for their entire life, not their entire life, but they take the same paths as they're moving around the place. And so it's almost like there are proper trails. It's a remote volcano. It takes 10 hours or so to get there on a boat, 10 hours to hike to the top or whatever. But the tortoise keep it open like hiking trails like you would see in the Cascades or something like that, because just these thousands of tortoise are following the same track around the place. They make these dirt trails around. So it's actually pretty easy. It wasn't easy. Like, it was a tough hike to get to the top, but once you're at the top, there's a big caldera, and moving around the caldera was pretty easy because the tortoise would make these like dirt tracks.
Oh my God, that's wild. Was it a very deep caldera?
Yeah, it's probably not quite a kilometer deep, but it's
Oh,
700 meters deep, something like that. Yeah. 10 kilometers across. Yeah, big.
oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay, okay. I was missing the scale here.
Oh, yeah, yeah, it's big.
Okay,
Yeah, these volcanoes are really, it'll be like a Hawaiian island, that sort of size.
sure. I guess like you say pumice, and then I all of a sudden I was like going back to all the different 7, 8 hour hikes that I've done up volcanoes, and they're mostly stratovolcanoes, even though I know that didn't really make sense for the Galapagos, but I was just like, okay, what are they doing? What are these tortoises doing?
Yeah, yeah.
That's
The Galapagos
wild.
volcano, yeah, they're very much like Hawaiian shield volcanoes. So they have a slightly different morphology. They get steeper towards the middle. So the Hawaiian ones are bowl shaped, if you like an
Right.
upturned cereal bowl. Whereas these ones have the shallow slopes at the bottom and then they get steep towards the middle.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Wow.
That's, is that a
Yeah,
suitable tea time
that's
story?
it's incredibly suitable. I don't maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I feel like a few at least of the listeners when I say that I didn't think over necessarily the morphology so much of the Galapagos versus the Hawaiian volcanoes, thinking that they would be very similar. So that's cool that they're very different. Fascinating. So in order to hike that, before we have people running to go there, because this is such a widely listened to podcast, did you need to get special permits from the Ecuador government to do this?
Yeah, so Galapagos is a UNESCO World Heritage Park site, and the islands are protected, and there's a protected ocean site around the outside as well with limited fishing and things like that. Within the Galapagos National Park, there are 4 settlements which are technically outside of the park. Anybody can fly there. If you're in Ecuador, you can take internal flights from Ecuador to Galapagos and you can stay in the towns. And you can see cool things from the town. You can see the sort of swimming marine iguana and the birds and things like that, the sea lions and everything. If you want to get outside of the park, it becomes much more difficult. You either have to go on like a boat tour, which are expensive and they limit the numbers of people that go on these boat tours, Or as scientists, you can submit basically research proposals to the Galapagos National Park, and they review it really thoroughly. And you have to be very specific about when you're going to go, where you're going to go, what you're going to sample, and things like that. So it's a long permitting process to get there. Yeah, they're very
Okay.
thorough, and the park is super helpful and help. There's also the Charles Darwin Foundation, which exists on the island and can help out with logistical support for scientists and things like that. But it is a long process.
That's okay. That's cool. And I guess it just feels good. I feel that it's hard to get there. Not everybody could get there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And it was a crazy time in my life when I was working a lot on the Galapagos stuff because inadvertently I was interested in geochemistry and volcanoes, but you can't work on Galapagos and not also get involved with ecology and the biodiversity
Mm,
aspect as well. So I ended up going to a lot of talks and seminars of things working. I once did a presentation like with David Attenborough, which was mad
that's
because
crazy.
we were just at an event because you just start going into all of these events about the biology as well as the geology, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was super cool to get those two groups talking to each other.
Definitely. We're all cousins to a degree, but that's wild. Oh my God, that's so cool. That's also tea. There you go.
Okay, okay. Why
New
not
deal. One
now?
time I gave a talk with David Attenborough.
Next time I'm in the US and someone asks me for tea, I won't
There
go
you go.
run, go, won't go
Yeah.
running for my China teapot.
I love it. All right. So thank you very much for your tea, but let's start talking about what we want to talk about here. And that's more so that your research now is connecting volcano geochemistry, magma plumbing systems, and processes that ultimately will form ore deposits. So now, whether it's Galapagos basalt erupting last year or a billion-year-old layered intrusion, geochemical language more or less is going to be fairly similar, but we just need to translate it between the disciplines. And I think this year, for the first time, I'm going to the American Geophysical Union conference, and it's trying to do the same thing. Uh, AGU is based here in Washington, D.C., where I live, and I've gone to a few of the stuff at their kind of like home base. And a lot of it is they're talking about mining without miners there. And it's just like, we're actually smart too. It's not
Yeah,
just
yeah.
researchers that are, but also I think they don't realize sometimes just how similar what is being done in the purely research space can translate to being helpful towards what we're doing in mining, and how much we're doing over on this side is actually not so far off. Anyway, side quest there.
No, but
So
I think, sorry, I do think that's like a super important point. Like, I started working, I was part of very much the academic volcano community, and I started going to these more economic geology conferences. And the overlap is particularly in what I do, the orthomagmatic stuff, but also porphyries and epithermal
yeah.
deposits as well, anything to do with the volatiles coming off of magmas. But people were using similar techniques, similar models, but developing them like in totally siloed ways and not talking to one
Mm,
another. Or the way that the volcanologists, based on maybe geophysical data of active volcanoes, the way that they were picturing the structure of the crust beneath an active volcano today, the models have evolved quite a lot recently in that sort of discipline. And the economic geologists are working on bushveld, if you like, or something like that. And still using the older models from volcanology. And it just seemed to me like it really seemed to me that the economic geologists and volcanologists are working on exactly the same systems using very similar models and not talking to one another. And there was great scope for data that mining geologists were collecting to inform volcanoes, data from active volcanoes, particularly to inform the way that we're looking at these ancient magmatic systems.
and so you talk about layered magmatic systems, which 100%, but talking from, I do a lot of work in the porphyry epithermal space. And in that sense, we're still working off of these conceptual models. We have a good handle what's going on, as you say, at the top, right? Because that's where all of our data is from. But then we're always just drawing these intrusions at depth, right? Because we're to some degree will intersect them, right? That's a lot of times, like, that's the porphyry, right? But a lot of times we'll be, especially in the epithermal space, we'll be saying, okay, so we have our epithermal here, and that potentially at some depth here is the porphyry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all this stuff that's just so conceptual,
Yeah.
where, as you say, in the volcanology space, you guys have done so much great work in using less black box geophysics to try
Yeah.
and really flesh all that out, and to for our two sides to be talking, I think would be unbelievable. And I would also go as far as to say that there would be funding for the academic research from the mining space to really to no longer be putting up these models, as you say, from the 1960s, 1970s that we haven't updated. So I think that there's great scope in there as well.
Yeah. Do you know, I think there are several reasons for that. I think that partly, obviously, when you're working on active volcanic systems, there are opportunities to get data sets that you can't get with ancient mineralized systems that you might want to mine today. It's pretty handy to be able to have earthquakes moving about and showing you where the magmas are within the crust, or be able to use like magnetotellurics or something like that to image the crustal structure, because you can pick out melt in a way that you can't differentiate different rock types. The other thing, I don't know whether this is controversial, but sometimes I wonder whether the volcanology community has historically just had a load less money, so it had to be a load more creative with the types of data they're looking at and squeeze a lot more out of smaller amounts of data. There's not opportunities in the purely academic space to go and drill a load of boreholes to try and intersect these things. So I don't know whether it's had to be, whether that's how these two fields have evolved a little bit differently, is because the academics have just been poor and had to be creative with the way that they interpret their rocks.
Yeah, and I think too, and look, I say this from being somebody that's only the ripe old age of 38, so I can't know exactly what it was like pre 1990, early 1990s. You have a lot of active volcanism, say in Chile, where I lived for quite some time, and you have a lot of ore forming systems that are very young, both porphyry and epithermal. And I would wonder, with the accessibility of Chile, of Argentina, Peru as well, really all the Andes because it's so young. I would wonder if there wasn't more space now to have some overlap there and to work on that kind of porphyry epithermal transition, and kind of in a space too where there's active mining going on. So you have volcanism plus mining.
Yeah,
So
100%. I think Indonesia also is another
that's a
example
great one. Yeah.
where there are really, you just move away from the arc and you can intersect active volcanoes and then slightly older porphyry systems. They're all related. We're just seeing different parts of the system. So I think that's a big area for future research for sure.
And a big one too, Coase has done a ton of work on it, but you have the Tuju Bukit system, which is also just outside of the Aegean caldera complex where I did my own research. The Cowesian volcano is mineralized as well, which is pretty cool. But Tuju Bukit is just, you can see the Aegean caldera complex, the active arc, right from Tuju Bukit. And that's a massive mine. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you. There's just so much opportunity for this crossover now. Oof.
And that's, I guess that's the point of the research that I do, is that the processes that are forming these different things are the same, whether it's like the thermodynamics that controls which phases form at what temperature or whatever, or it's the physics of how you separate a fluid out from a magma or crystals or whatever else. We're just looking at different crustal depths. If we want to make these large system models, we need to all talk to each other and link things up.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Now I just have 1,000 different volcanoes running through my mind. But here's another one, active, and they're just mining it. Like,
Yeah.
it's just wild. Yeah. I think there's so much space for that. And I can't wait to see how this continues to evolve. I remember just being at SEG what was it? Oh my God, just a few months ago, a few weeks ago, maybe. Who knows? Time is relative. And another researcher, and I need to look her up because I need to send her a message, but she was talking at, to me, cross purposes. I was probably the only person in the room that really knew about it because it was an area that I had studied, but it was just the same thing, just talking about the porphyry epithermal, like this systematics of it, but just being like, yeah, and we've done this from non-active volcanoes, but I'm like, have you looked at GeoChemISTea?
Yeah.
And just not knowing, because it becomes so obscured to an extent. There's a lot of research out there because there is so much. Like, how can you know it all as well?
I
So
guess by making friends with each other and collaborating.
exactly.
That's
Yeah,
always been, that's always through everything that I've done. I've always thought that the best thing is to collaborate and have a beer, have a tea with each other and have a chat. And you can link up geophysicists with geochemists, or you can link up economic geologists with volcanologists. And there's a lot of value in networking, not trying to be an expert of everything, but just trying to be a good collaborator and someone that works well with other people. That's always done. I don't think I'm the cleverest guy in the room, but I've always thought that just being able to talk to people and having good conversations is a great skill.
I agree. I also, while I may seem the most clever person in the room, I'm definitely kidding. I'm definitely not. And it's even with upgrading your skill sets too, it comes from talking with people, and it's not like any kind of stealing proprietary knowledge. I find that everybody that I talk to is very willing to share, because we're all just more so excited about what we've seen, what we've worked on, and how it can continue on, because maybe we've turned a chapter in our lives and we can no longer pursue something because we're just doing something different. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I love it.
yeah, I guess I've always tried to never feel like, if you're chatting to someone, never feel like a question is a stupid question. If you're talking to somebody who does something totally different to you and you find it interesting, I've always just tried to ask all my questions. And so got a surface level knowledge of lots of things.
That's what this podcast is about. I try and ask all those questions, particularly that I feel that people may feel intimidated to ask, because it's like, what is the difference between a radioactive isotope and a normal isotope?
Yeah.
Like, stuff like that. But it's just, we get to a point in our careers where I find too that we feel intimidated to ask something that we perceive as basic. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because if you're not in this case, and I always come back to isotopes because they haunt me. But if you're not an isotope geologist or an isotope geochemist, excuse me, then why would you, to a degree, know all the different particulars of it? But that's something why I do this podcast, because it's about mentorship, and it's about asking all those questions, and about opening kind of opportunities for people to then reach out to perhaps some of the guests if they have something that they are interested in.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Like my experience is that 90% of people are like excited to teach people about their subject area. And the
mm,
10% of people which aren't are not the ones that you want to work with anyway. So don't worry
such
about
a
it.
good point. Yeah. Don't sweat it.
Yeah.
Let's see. I guess right before we get super technical, and we've touched on this a lot, I think we've gone over how you started to become part of this kind of overlap between volcanology and magmatic mineralization. But I think something, when we talk about breaking things down and making it more simple, can we just talk about just how they are seen as part of the same story? What makes them so related?
Yeah. Like when I can only speak from the way that I see things. Magmas are generated inside in the Earth's mantle. And those mantle processes, which are theoretical, pretty academic problems, those mantle processes generate magmas of whatever composition, but for some reason they might be enriched in metals. And that's a process that we would want to understand, both from like a fundamental petrological viewpoint, but also from an economic viewpoint, if you want to start
Mm,
trying to understand where to explore for deposits. Then magmas move up through the earth and stuff happens to them. They cool and they fractionally crystallize, but they can also interact with their country rock and they can assimilate that country rock. Some of those country rocks might be metal bearing or they might be sulfur bearing, which could cause sulfides to precipitate, which lots of your listeners will know are important for mineralizing processes. But it doesn't matter whether you're a volcanologist and you want to know what's controlling the composition of your erupted products at the surface, or whether you're an economic geologist and you want to know whether, what processes are controlling whether your magma has like a propensity to have formed mineralization. The process itself is exactly the same. Then I guess that's like a geochemistry angle, but there's also a physical angle as well. So volcanologists are very interested in like how gases move about inside magma chambers to generate pressure and trigger eruptions. But economic geologists are very interested in how sulfide droplets, which carry a lot of the metals, sink within mushes and accumulate through these physical processes. And that's where you would find high-grade ores and you would go mine. Again, the physical processes, just controlling what's happening within that magma body, are exactly the same. And that's from a sort of orthomagmatic viewpoint. Fractional crystallization and assimilation happen beneath volcanoes and control eruptive processes, but they also are important in forming mineral deposits, and the physics the same. But there's also the porphyry angle, which is even stronger, if you like, because it's the saturation of gases within magmas and the accumulation of bubbles and the pressure generated by bubbles that cause volcanoes to erupt. But of course, those same gases can contain a lot of metals and move up through the crust and precipitate porphyry mineralization. So, again, the processes that cause gases to saturate, become rich in things like chlorine and metals, are the same in a volcano as they would be in a porphyry system. So that's the link. The link is that the processes are the same, depending on whether you're looking at a mineralization outcome or a volcanic outcome. The Earth does the same thing.
Yeah, that's such a good answer.
I guess as geologists, as geochemists, as petrologists, what we're trying to understand is the governing chemistry, the governing physics, what makes these magmas do these particular things so that we can predict the outcome.
Totally. And I think something that I'll just mention, really for more so the benefit of the listeners, is for the longest time, I felt that applied geochemistry, as I use it in my kind of daily life in exploration and geomet, whatever it is that I'm doing, was very separate from petrology. But then I've been working on projects lately where really all the amount of referencing back to like pure petrology papers that I've been doing recently, I wonder why I hadn't done it before. And it's just because I didn't have maybe the need, but also it comes from working with different geochemists and different styles and everything. And I was working with this one geochemist who we were working on, I think, some diabases. And she's just referencing me to this book. And then there I was just deep diving into petrology. And here I became back into whatever it was, 2006, 2007, into my igneous petrology class. So I would say, too, for everybody listening out there, there's so much petrology that we need to be incorporating into our applied geochemistry for working in the mining industry. And don't forget about it and go back to it because it's incredibly helpful. Besides giving you an understanding about the fundamental process of what's happening, there's also some really clever diagrams in there that can give you just that much more enhancement to any kind of study that you're doing. So yeah, there's this whole kind of connection that we forget about as soon as we enter the mining industry, I feel, just to an extent as geochemists. And maybe it's just me talking about myself. I've had like my own like little renaissance the past kind of few years on it.
Yeah, I think it's very tempting for anybody to take a sample, crush it, grind it into a powder, send it off an assay or whatever, and get your data back and plot it out. But there's a lot of value to looking at the petrology, the textures, the context of the analysis that you're getting. But maybe that's where there is synergy between industry and academia as well. Industry geologists are working on big projects. They're often very busy. They're working over big areas and they have commercial objectives. If they want to get down into the nitty gritty, is that an English expression? I think it is. If they want to get,
yeah, we got that one too.
If they want to get down into the real detail, that's where there are opportunities, I think, to team up with academics, get PhD students, master's students, and people on board to start looking at that kind of finer detail that people like you, Sam, probably wouldn't have routinely time for.
I think also something that, and this is not to hate on people that have been getting PhDs, but I think something that we've been suffering from in these kind of purely mining PhDs is that you'll have pick a deposit and you will find like particularly maybe something older. Like here we know how it formed because it's still forming. But maybe go up to somewhere in the Abitibi, for instance, in Canada. You'll find a PhD or 10 PhDs about the same deposit, which is great in the sense that there's more information coming out. But the focus has been so strong on how did this form? And they'll maybe do this with two drill holes of data. It becomes so strongly focused on how did this form, and everybody's trying to put their stamp on it, that there's so much, I feel now, noise that starts to occur in these kind of purely economic geology PhDs that, and excuse me if I'm speaking out of turn for anybody listening that takes offense to this, and maybe if you're taking offense to this, maybe then call me up and we'll do a show on it. But I don't know. I think, as we've just been talking about, I think there's just so much strength of pulling in people from outside of economic geology to get a fresher look as to how we're looking at these things, because maybe it's not all about how this one deposit solely formed. And there's a lot of great economic geology PhDs out there, don't get me wrong. But sometimes we become so hyper focused that we lose sight of kind of maybe what are some broader questions that could be more helpful.
Like processes,
Mm.
understanding processes rather than understanding systems. For me, that's the more interesting thing to tackle.
And I don't think that would be something that is unhelpful, because we also talk a lot about, say, the mineral systems approaches, and that's a lot of what big companies use. Okay, do we have these large order, first order faults? Do we have this? Do we have that? Okay, now we vectored into an area that should produce a certain type of deposit. Let's go focus in on this area. But I think when you look at the geochem impact of that, we're looking for sometimes specific ratios. We're looking for specific, not necessarily purely numbers, but we're not looking more so at process, in my opinion. We're looking for specific things that check boxes that are more based on what we see in assay data, as opposed to thinking about things on a larger scale. Do we have, as I said, these structures? Do we have this in the geophysics? Do we have this in the geochem? And so it's these superficial things, as opposed to sometimes maybe thinking more so deeper.
A lot of the approach that I've taken for various reasons in my career, I've ended up being forced to work on a particular system. For example, Galapagos. The job that I got in Cambridge was to work on Galapagos volcanoes very specifically. And so I started off with the study area rather than studying off with the scientific problem that I wanted to solve. And then what I would do is think about what is it that's special about this system which can give me a deeper insight into kind of something more fundamental that's happening. I don't just want to understand a Galapagos volcano, but what's special about Galapagos that I can investigate that is then broadly applicable across the globe to different volcanoes. Does that make sense?
I think so. When I think about Galapagos, right, I'm like, okay, Galapagos, hotspot, just like Hawaii. Just what's another one? Canaries. It's something that is just, okay, where there's a plume, the plates are moving. Okay, check, check, check. I understand what's going on. But maybe asking a deeper question about that is where the science is.
Yeah, and to elaborate, Galapagos is like Hawaii, and so there is a project that you can do there, or there are projects that people are still doing. They're just doing characterization work, looking at what rocks are there, what are the composition of the rocks that are there, what's the eruption frequency. I guess that's the sort of mineral systems type thing applied in volcanology. But there are reasons why Galapagos is different to Hawaii, and so we can investigate almost by comparing to Hawaii, we can get new information. So, for example, Galapagos is basically on the equator. The islands overlap the equator, whereas Hawaii is obviously a bit further north. And so Galapagos gets way more flypasts from satellites. And so the geophysical record of things like ground deformation is better in Galapagos than it is elsewhere. There's also not many clouds there. So you have a great satellite-based record of volcano deformation. And that's something that I really picked up on and investigated in detail, trying to link our petrological records of what was happening in the magma chamber beneath the volcano with the geophysical record of how the volcano was behaving in the build up to an eruption, and trying to link those two things together. And that is easier in Galapagos than it is in Hawaii because there's this better geophysical record. But Galapagos, Hawaii has more or less one volcano, more or less. It's not quite one volcano active at a time. And the chain gets, you all remember that the Hawaiian chain and the Emperor Seamount chain, they get older as you get away from the hotspot. But Galapagos has a whole load of volcanoes which are currently active, spread over a wide area. It's still a hotspot, but there are 20 active volcanoes spread over 100 square kilometers. Maybe I've just made that number up, but over a large area. So why? What's different about Galapagos that is making that happen? And if we can understand why the plume is smeared out rather than just a single point like it is in Hawaii, we can think about how plume parameters, the temperature of the plume, or the way the plume is melting the mantle, is affecting those kind of crustal and volcanic processes. So sometimes for me, it's been about finding the unique aspect of the system that I'm forced to study for whatever reason and exploiting that to understand fundamental processes.
Did you find an answer to that?
The plume one we're still working on. I have a PhD student working on it at the moment.
Okay. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know that. I just presumed like Hawaii, like Yellowstone, Canaries, that things just moved away and
Yeah.
that was it. I did not realize that there were so many active volcanoes in
Yeah,
Galapagos.
so the reason that there are more active volcanoes is because obviously Hawaii is in the middle of a tectonic plate, but
Hmm.
Galapagos is near a spreading center. So
Oh, okay.
Iceland is on a spreading center. It's on the
Yes.
Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Hawaii is nowhere near a spreading center, and Galapagos is near a spreading center. It's near the Galapagos spreading center. So the plume comes up, but the way the mantle is affected by that spreading center, which is a couple of 100 kilometers away, and that seems to be spreading out the melting region. So the plume is being pulled towards the spreading center. So
That's pretty cool.
yeah, it's interesting. And then you can ask the question, like I say, what impact does that have on the way magmas are generated and move through the crust? Because the plume is different temperatures in different places.
I love it. I have 1,000 questions that probably aren't related, and these are not in the show notes.
No, we've gone off script.
We've gone off script, which is fine, I think. Do you then see, in terms of what we're seeing currently at Galapagos, do you see anything there that's related to your studies that you're doing currently in Ireland with your layered melt intrusions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the stuff that we're looking at in Ireland is just the exposed guts of a plume volcano. So the Irish volcanoes are Paleogene age, they're 60 million years old, but they're part of the North Atlantic igneous province.
That's
60
much younger
million.
than I would have thought.
Yeah, it is, which means that they're fresh and easy to work on
Yeah.
because once things start going altered, it all becomes much more difficult. But
Mm.
60 million years ago, the eastern coast of Canada was touching Scotland and Ireland, and Greenland was in between. And over 60 million years, the Atlantic has opened up. But that hotspot, that plume that we were just talking about beneath Iceland was still there, right? So 60 million years ago, the Atlantic was beginning to break apart, but the Icelandic hotspot was there. So what we're seeing now, well, Skagerrak in Greenland, but the ones that I'm working on in Ireland, they're just the early expression of the Icelandic hotspot. And they've been uplifted and eroded, so we can see the magma chamber. That's what the layered intrusion is. But that magma chamber is more or less the same as what is beneath modern day Icelandic volcanoes. So by studying these sort of ancient analogs, we're able to see, like I say, the guts of a modern day Icelandic volcano. People don't really think about that.
No, I have not. And I'm probably in that sense most people because of the ignorance and naivety. The problem then being, now going back to Galapagos, thinking about it, potentially is it being subducted. So you wouldn't necessarily see it.
No, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, things get subducted or accreted onto continents. Yeah.
Okay.
In this case, I guess they haven't. They've just rifted apart. People have looked at the long-term kind of evolution of the Galapagos hotspot by accreted terrains on the side of South America, but it's a different story. But certainly, you know that the Hawaiian hotspot has stayed in one place as the plate has moved over the top of it. In the Icelandic hotspot has done the same thing, but the two plates have rifted apart from one another. So what we're seeing in Ireland and Scotland, but also in kind of Baffin Island and the east coast of Canada, they're just the early expressions of that same hotspot. And there's chains of volcanic activity that are converging on modern day Iceland, either side of the Atlantic.
Now I just have too much to think about. I love it. Let's go back to some of the questions I had. So let's talk about some volatiles at this point. So I don't usually get so, I feel, off track, but this has been fascinating.
We've moved off the script and just
We've moved so off this
chatted more generally.
more generally. So early work in the Galapagos, you use some melt inclusions and barometry to show how volatiles and magma recharge control eruption timing. What did these studies teach you about how magmas evolve? And does this same information help us interpret the fossil record in some of the plutonic systems?
I think so. Those are two different things that I've worked on a little bit.
Yeah.
So a lot of the volatile stuff that I did was in Italy. To talk about volatiles in Italy.
I do. Honestly, I really do. Just because, yeah. I would love to talk. First of all, I love volatiles, and volatiles are super important when we're talking about economic geology, metal transport, and all that kind of stuff. And then also, I love Italy. So let's talk about Italy.
Yeah, so volatiles are one of those when you're working in volcanic systems, but also mineralizing systems. Volatiles are one of these things which are really important and underpin a lot of the stuff that we're interested in, but are just really difficult to get a handle on and understand. For example, like how much gas is there in a magma? When does that gas exhaust from the magma? What controls where those volatiles move and how they precipitate metals? They're difficult elements to analyze and they misbehave in geological systems in a way that makes it difficult for us to track them. So in my earliest PhD research, people use melt inclusions in volcanic systems to try and understand volatile concentrations. These are little pockets of magma that get trapped in crystals as they grow. And then when that crystal comes up towards the surface and erupts, the melt inclusions hold on to their volatiles. Those volatiles aren't able to exsolve and form gas bubbles because they're trapped within the crystal, like little pressure vessel. And people have known this since the 1980s or whatever, the 80s and 90s, people were starting to develop techniques so they could measure melt inclusions. But they're really difficult to prepare, really difficult to analyze. And in more recent times, we've realized they're unreliable records of magma volatile concentrations. Things like hydrogen in water can diffuse really quickly through host crystals. In the timescale of like hours, a melt inclusion can reset its water content by this sort of diffusion process. And that turned out to be a really big problem. And so in my PhD, I was trying to develop alternative geochemical methods for understanding the volatile content of magmas, and particularly focused on like hydrous minerals, common hydrous minerals like apatites and biotites and amphiboles, mostly apatites, and how we can understand the composition of these volatile bearing minerals to get at the volatile concentrations and behaviors in the magma that those minerals formed from. And I applied it in Italy to this really big volcano called Campi Flegrei, which is certainly Europe's most hazardous volcano, but one of the most hazardous volcanoes in the world. It's a hugely active system which has produced lots of eruptions within the last few thousand years, and 3.5 million people live there now. So
Boy.
we want to know what the volatiles are doing. We want to know what the volatiles are doing before eruptions. We want to know how the volatiles in magmas, the chemistry of those would be related to the chemistry of fumaroles and kind of gas vents at the surface, all of these sorts of things. So it was a good place to develop this apatite or hydrous mineral based method for understanding magma volatile behaviors. But it got picked up and used more generally, and people are using it in porphyry systems now. I've recently been collaborating with some colleagues applying this method to understand in porphyry systems are barren versus mineralized systems, mineralized magmas in the same system. They have different volatile content. When in the evolution of the magma would it saturate in volatiles and then move up through the country rock and deposit its metals? So that's just a sort of method development that is applicable both in volcanology and economic geology.
That's fascinating because one of the biggest things for explorers in the porphyry space is just that it's not that you can find a porphyry anywhere, but you can find a porphyry anywhere. And this whole thing about when, because it's a when kind of thing for us, when in the geologic record are you in a belt that is going to be endowed? And there's lots of thoughts, right, in terms of the angles of subducting plates. And does that give, as we say, more volatiles, like, and what is all of those kind of systematics that are happening in that when phase that will create a productive porphyry. And yeah, it's super interesting to hear about this methodology. It's pretty cool that you're like, no big deal. That was just something I did during my PhD. But it's pretty cool to hear about how something that you developed from a purely perspective of volcano research and potentially even hazard research. And now it's something that's being picked up by some other researchers here in our economic geology space. We're talking so much because I love this topic, but I want to, even though we haven't really asked any of the other questions that I had, I wanted to finish on asking a question about what do you see as other parts of your research or research that's being done in the volcano space that is applicable, you think, to economic geology research or things that have been picked up already?
There are a lot, actually. We've touched on some of the things that I'm really interested in at the moment. I think, to like at the most fundamental level, I think that the way that volcanologists view crustal magma systems has diverged from the way that a lot of economic geologists are still understanding the very fundamental conceptual model. So people say in volcanology, there's been this paradigm shift, right? It's not a great term, but what they mean is that volcanologists, by and large, don't really consider magma chambers anymore to exist as a
Tell
thing.
me more.
Magma chambers are out.
Okay,
This is
no more
built up of
batholiths. What's going
no,
on?
no more batholiths. Over the years, there's just been this creeping suspicion that the idea of there being this big liquid pool of magma in the crust is a problematic conceptual model, because it's not fair to say none, but very few active volcanoes today where we have great geophysical imaging, seismic tomography, magnetotellurics, whatever. We don't see magma chambers. We don't see, and they should be, probably with a few caveats, but they should be detectable. You would expect to see a big liquid body beneath a volcano,
Yeah.
and we don't in active volcanoes today. Also, when you look at the petrology of crystals and eruptions, you don't see one population of crystals. This is getting into that igneous petrology that we were talking about before. You don't see one population of crystals. You know, if you think about plagioclase zoning, which you would have looked at in igneous petrology practicals, in a single basalt lava, the zoning texture of almost every plagioclase crystal in there is different, which means that they haven't all grown in one magma chamber through some like fractional crystallization process. And then if you think about it, just
Is fractional crystallization out?
no, fractional crystallization
Okay,
is
we're
still
still
in,
in. We're
but
still in.
it's just more complicated than the simple model that we were always
Fine.
taught 10 years ago.
Fine.
And then if you just think about it from a purely conceptual perspective, most arc volcanoes are going to be active. They're going to be magmatically active for 500,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years for sure. Like, how would the crust thermally respond to magma being intruded over 500,000 years? It's not going to stay like a cold, rigid crust with just one body of liquid magma, one magma chamber beneath the volcano. And so volcanologists have now transitioned to, there are obviously exceptions and people argue about it and there are nuances. Volcanologists have transitioned to this model that volcanoes are underlain by these transcrustal systems, these crustal scale hot zones, if you like, where from a kilometer beneath the volcano the way to the Moho, there is magma. It's mush. It's mostly crystalline. It's like an oil reservoir where there's like liquid magma between solid grains of crystals, and within that there are just these liquid-rich pockets. And that's a pretty,
I see. Okay.
yeah. And before an eruption, these liquid-rich pockets, they amalgamate somehow, and that generates a large volume of liquid that then erupts. But for the majority of the time that the volcano exists, the crust is in this like mushy state where there isn't a large liquid-rich body of magma. That has like chemical and kind of rheological implications for the way that we understand the way that these systems have evolved. But I don't think that the economic geology community is on board with that. The people, of course, there are exceptions. Some people are working on this, but if you go to talks by people working on, orthomagmatic deposits, they're often still thinking within the sort of magma chamber paradigm and not thinking about huge crustal scale systems. I think that's
I
important.
think my recommendation here to the Volcanoes community, though, would be to come to our conferences and to talk about this if you haven't started already. And I'm going to pull up this diagram on my computer right now. And many people listening to this podcast knows the one that I'm talking about, but it will just be something like this diagram that's loading right now. So this is a Hedenquist et al. 1996. And everybody that's just listening, it's got the porphyry at depth. It has the low sulfidation to the left. It's got the high sulfidation up at the top, the crater lake of the volcano. It, to an extent, you'll have a skarn deposit coming off of like the porphyry. Point being is that at depth, what is this porphyry quote system, which is just supposed to be connected more so at depth to these just very liquidy magma chambers. And this diagram has been out there since the beginning of time, right? We're just looking at the internet now, guys, and you can see all of these different variations on this diagram. Here's another one. I don't know who this author is, but magma chamber, volume greater than 100 cubic kilometers. Point being is that all of our literature recycles basically the same diagram because we don't have information about this depth piece, right? It's all about the batholith at depth. We've seen in our drill core, we've seen what we believe to be this batholith because it goes for so long and we see it in so much of our drill core. So we're going on the rock record, right? It's not just we've made it out of thin air, but all these diagrams date back to the 60s and the 70s, and we just continue to perpetuate it. There is none of this new knowledge, to my knowledge, about what you're talking about here. So this is going to be a paradigm shift for the economic geology community, but it has to start somewhere.
I guess what I'm noticing in the diagrams that you're pulling up is that they either draw a liquid magma chamber in the shallow crust, a bit like that, or they just draw the top of the magma chamber and then concern themselves with all the porphyry mineralizing processes that happen above that. And the magma chamber is just seeing the top of this like
magma chamber at depth.
Magma chamber at depth.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that the volcanologists are realizing that there's a whole lot of stuff that happens between the mantle and the top of that magma chamber. And we're not even thinking it being a magma chamber anymore. We're thinking of it being a crustal-scale magma column and all of the kind of physics and chemistry that happens as the melts move up from their mantle source to magma chamber at depth.
Yeah.
Are important. And I think, we're seeing all these models here and they're all looking very similar.
They're all very similar because we don't have this information. There's no reason for us to have this information, to collect this information. It's not going to necessarily perhaps improve our deposit scale model, which is what we have to present to the mining company. And it's just going based off of literature from decades ago.
But if you want to start thinking about when does mineralization happen, why would there be mineralization in this deposit, not this one, and so on? These are globally important questions, I think. I think you hit on exactly the right point. Like, we have to go to each other's conferences. I held a conference in Dublin this year, which brought together the Mineral Deposit Studies Group and the Volcanic Magmatic Studies Group in the UK and Ireland, and it was a really productive experience to get all of the kind of early career exploration people in the same room as the volcano PhD people, get the professors talking to each other and have not even parallel sessions, but have some joint sessions on things like porphyry mineralization so that people are exposed to one another's ideas. I think this is changing, partly as we already said about funding. There's a necessity now to have a more applied angle to research. And I think that is positive, actually, in terms of moving forwards in these models.
Look, I love it. I think that this has been an amazing conversation, and I could keep going on this one. We should do this again sometime.
Yeah, part two.
Part two. I love it. But I want to thank you so much for being here, Mike, and I hope that you enjoyed talking about what you're working on, different things that are aligning and not aligning. I want to thank everybody for listening to GeoChemISTea, and a big thanks to Mike Stock for being on the show, dishing some tea and talking about volcanoes and the intersection between volcanoes. And I guess we started out with orthomagmatic systems, but we delved now into porphyry, slightly into epithermal, a little bit of all of it. I want to thank our sponsor, LKI Consulting, and to It's Water and Coma Media for our music. And I'm looking forward to chatting with everybody next month.
Cheers. Thanks, Sam.